All right, what up, everybody? This is going to be my first official attempt at a tutorial in quite some time. I made some forever ago, but this is going to be my first one in honestly years. And today I just want to go over some serum techniques. So to start it off, here's some random bullshit I made in like 2 seconds today. Anyway, yeah, it's not very good, but a lot of the times I like to make little sound design experiments and just make random grooves without really trying to make a good piece of music, just because I find that it's good practice. Okay, so bear with me here. I hope that this tutorial does not corrupt like last time. I think this should work. We'll see. Hopefully the audio quality is acceptable and everything is good. So for this tutorial, all we're going to be using is X for serum, and possibly some X for OTT. OTT is free. I assume you own Serum or have torrented it or something. You should definitely support the developers and buy it if you can. Or maybe you rent it with Splice or something. But yeah, so we're going to go over some serum techniques here. And the first main one, first of all, this is not an intro serum. This is a pretty advanced serum tutorial, or at least covering some pretty specific techniques. So if you're not familiar with serum, I would recommend either watching some intro tutorials or read the manual, or just go practice or whatever, because all of this is based on the presuppositions that you know how the synthesizer works, you know what each oscillator does, you know how the filter works, you know how the effects works, and we're going to be going into some more advanced techniques and like workflow tips here. Is it still recording? Okay, I think we're good. So the first thing I want to go over is custom wavetable creation. I know this is a feature that a lot of people know about with Serum. I don't know how much people use it on a day-to-day basis or a average basis or whatever, but something that probably the thing that I like most about Serum is the ability to create custom wavetables. And dragging in audio is probably the best way to do it. So I'm going to go over just one or two, maybe three examples of dragging in audio, and my workflow for then creating the wavetable from there. And then, you know, the whole idea with that is that when you create your own wavetables, you can just have a much more unique basis to go off of instead of using, you know, one of the geez, I have so many wavetables in here. Instead of using one of the stock wavetables or whatever, you know. So when you're creating your own wavetables, you're going to have just that much of an edge in the game of making a super cool bass. So to start off, I mean, the first thing would be sample selection, right? So to create a nice sounding wavetable, I've found that the best sounding samples to import are short, have minimal dead space, and have a lot of harmonic content. So this is just a folder of Foley samples that I have. This is Jed Sound Twisted. And I did a little bit of cheating. I already tried using this sound before, and I know that's going to have a pretty decent result. You're going to see how to work with a sample that isn't ideal, but is still pretty good. So generally for your criteria, you want a relatively short sample that has a cool amount of harmonic content. Sorry, I'm just paranoid about the recording failing here, but I think using this OBS thing is going to work pretty well. So, right, to import an audio sample into Serum, what you do is just grab it from the Ableton browser, and then you drag it onto the window in Serum. And then you see that you have all these options here: import normal, dynamic pitch follow, import constant, and then all these FFT options. So in my experience, what usually works best when you're importing small audio samples like this is FFT 1024 or FFT 2048. So just from the get-go, let's try FFT 1024. Okay, so right off the bat, you can see that we actually got a pretty good result. There's a lot of dead space at the end of the sample because of how the sample kind of trails off. But in my opinion, there's a lot of really cool sounding frames with really rich content at the beginning here. So again, that was FFT 1024, and I believe that means fixed frame something. So that basically that just cuts the whole sample equally based on this amount of frames. So we can try it in FFT 2048 as well. So this also sounds pretty good. My initial impression is that there's slightly less usable frames. But the frames that do sound good sound slightly higher resolution. And then just for the sake of experimentation, let's go ahead and try FFT 512. So those all sound pretty cool. Let's try some of these. Import normal. So as you can see, every single import mode actually has a pretty different result. And really to just get a feel for this process, it's just going to be a matter of practicing. Oh, that's not the... It's just going to be a matter of practicing and seeing how each one sounds based on each sample that you're using and then going from there. As always, I encourage everybody to understand the process of what we're doing. Never get caught up or hung up on a specific result or a specific way to get a specific noise, because at the end of the day, the reason we learn and the reason we watch these tutorials or make tutorials ourselves, or the reason we learn things is not to learn one specific outcome. We learn things to create a pattern so we can have a workflow for creating a variety of outcomes within one idea or one process or one workflow. So the idea here is that every single different import mode has a sort of unique characteristic that might work better or worse with a specific sample. I will say that I generally, when I'm doing this specific technique with a shorter sample, I usually end up preferring FFT 1024, FFT 2048. So okay, so for the sake of this tutorial, let's go ahead and go with that FFT 2048. So we dragged in the sample. It sounds pretty cool. We have some cool single cycle waveforms and a pretty cool wavetable. But what's the next step, right? Because this isn't the most usable thing in the world. So my next step is to go in and clean up the wavetable. So the wavetable editor is pretty dang powerful. You have the ability to process the wavetable or the sound that you drag in a multitude of ways and really just clean it up and make it pretty optimal. So you see right at the beginning here, we have a pretty much a dead wave single cycle. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. So then we have so then the sort of next step here is to find the range of usable content within the sound that you dragged in. So generally my process for that is just dragging the wavetable position around and again, just checking that I'm still recording here. I drag the wavetable position around and just find the sweet spot. So we're just going to go ahead and call this the end of the table. So you go into the wavetable editor again. If you don't know how to get in here and out of here, you probably shouldn't be watching this tutorial. Go ahead and review your serum, read the manual, whatever. But the wavetable editor is this little pencil in the upper right-hand corner of the wavetable viewer right here. So you go ahead and click on that. Then you go add remove, and you can go remove selected to end. So what that just did was remove every single cycle or every single piece of the wavetable from where we were selected to the end. So now we just have this sort of sweet spot. And this is pretty cool. So we have like this really rich harmonic content at the beginning here. Kind of like a gnarly sort of bass noise, and then it kind of mellows out to the end here. And as always, when you're creating custom content, I think it's a good idea to save every step of the way. So we could go ahead and save this, and it just automatically will save as the file name that you dragged it in as. So that's not a bad name to drag it in as. But you could add in maybe raw, because we haven't done much processing to it yet, but we kind of carved out the sweet spot. So the next step from here is to make the wavetable as clean as possible. So here's my general process for that. you can go to this process tab right here, and this can do a variety of things to the wavetables. I'll be totally honest with you. I'm not super familiar with what all of these do, but there's a couple go-tos that I use pretty regularly. So a good one to start with, at least in my opinion, is remove fundamental. So you can see the wavetable change just a little bit. And removing the fundamental will just remove the lowest frequency in the wavetable, i.e. the sub-bass note or the lowest bass frequency. And generally when we're making mid-range basses or we're making dubstep basses, the mid-range content and the sub-bass content will be separate, and we'll generally be cutting the low end out of the bass and programming our sub separately. So to get the most volume and the most cleanliness and just the best possible signal out of our mid-range bass, it's generally a good idea to remove the fundamental in the wavetable stage, just from the get-go. Yeah, I hope you're following me there. And then normalizing just makes these as loud as possible, within each of their frames. So we can normalize them as well. Normalize each, gained separately. So it's just a little bit cleaner, a little bit louder there. Then we can try the morph options, right? First one that usually sounds pretty good, morph crossfade. So then what this does is just crossfade in between all of these frames. Now you can see transitioning in between them is way smoother. I'm just drinking a beer, chilling out over here, making tutorials. All right. So then, after we do the morph process, well, first of all, we can try spectral as well. So we can remove morph table, and then try spectral and see how that sounds. So they both sound pretty good. I mean, really, it's a matter of taste and your individual wavetable. We're going to go ahead and go with morph for this one. And then we can do that same process again. Remove the fundamental, and then normalize each one. And what we end up with here is a pretty friggin' sweet, clean sounding custom wavetable. We can go ahead and save this again. We can save this as just the original file name that we dragged it in as, and then add processed to the end. Cool, I think we're still recording. This is great, we're killing it. Okay, so we made a custom wavetable. Where do we go from here? All right, so now I guess I'm just gonna walk through my general serum workflow. I just realized I had an OTT on this whole time. Jesus. I bet someone noticed that while watching. Like, dude, you had an OTT on the whole time. You never turned it off. Frick. So when we turned this OTT off, this was just a stock settings. It didn't have anything crazy on it. That's really funny. So generally my process when I'm making a custom bass or I'm making a new bass from scratch is either I'll take a wavetable that already exists or I downloaded from somewhere and find a sweet spot and go like kind of just imagine in my head like I just kind of play around with the wavetable position. I'm like, all right, okay, there's the sweet spot. And for this one, we can kind of hear the mellow end is down here and the aggressive end is up here. So I'm kind of picturing like a you know, kind of like a up, down, up bass, kind of like that. So then, you know, we start dragging out our LFOs, bring it up here. I always usually go to trigger, maybe sometimes envelope. Okay, so what I start doing at this phase is I find that sweet spot, and then I just drag out an LFO and I start playing with patterns. You can hear we have a pretty cool pattern going. I just put the tempo up to 145 because dubstep. And again, there's no effects, there's no filters, this is just a wavetable. And in my experience, building it step by step is usually the best way to go. If you start playing with the bend modes and the wavetable and the filter and the effects all at the same time, it can be easy to get off track. That's just my opinion. I'm sure plenty of people do it plenty of ways. So we have this pattern on the wavetable, getting this cool movement. Now I want to try just automating just a normal wobble right here. Quarter note, boom. Yeah, so that's pretty cool. What if we try putting a bend mode on? Just for reference, I'm usually using my keyboard to trigger MIDI notes when I'm working on patches like this. I have an Ableton Push and some MIDI controllers and stuff, but generally I just go ahead and hit M, turn the musical keyboard on, and then I find it easiest just to hold down a key while I manipulate the patch. One thing that I really like that they added in the new serum patch is that you can now see it bend from this view. I think that's really fucking cool. So that's cool. I really like the texture and the sort of feel that we're getting when the ASIM's just down here, but just for the lols, we could try playing with it. So that's cool. Are we still recording? Yes, I believe we are. All right, let's do this. So I like this. Let's run with it, right? We have a custom wavetable we made from scratch, or well, we made from an audio sample. We got some cool automation, so we're just wobbling the volume here, and then we're applying the same LFO to both the wavetable position and the bend mode. And now we can start getting a little interesting. We can try adding a high-pass filter right here, and we'll apply the same LFO that's doing the levels to the cutoff of the high-pass. And you can hear that just really adds a lot more of, it's cutting out a lot of frequencies, makes the spectral range of the sound more dynamic. And I think specifically the high 18. I think the high 18 really adds a lot of sort of vowel-y feel. We could even try automating the resonance a little bit. Yeah, I'm not crazy about that. So again, really what I'm trying to communicate with my workflow here is that this is all just experimentation. This is my general workflow, so I'll play with the wavetable, I'll play with the automation there, then add a filter, then we're about to go into the effects and sort of the final product, and then we're going to do processing after it. So it's just kind of a step-by-step workflow whose main focus is experimentation, right? It's all just about experimenting and finding cool stuff by accident. This could be completely different patch by patch. This is just one example going completely from scratch. I didn't practice this beforehand. I did choose the sample and made sure it would make an okay wavetable beforehand, but I did not try making a whole patch beforehand, so I'm just going completely from scratch here. So that sounds pretty good to me. So the next thing we can do is generally the first thing that I like before I start going to the other effects is adding just a little bit of stereo field. And then a lot of times I like automating the mix on this guy. And if you're listening on a nice setup, hopefully the stereo comes through in this recording. I'm not sure. I'll have to go back and check. But automating the dimension expander in Serum creates a really nice dynamic stereo field. So let's check this out. So you can see it expands out from mono out into the center field and our stereo field and comes back, which I think is always really cool. Add that sort of extra dynamic to your sound. I mean, even from here, we could really start finalizing the sound, but just for the sake of the video, we can play with some effects. We can try a flanger. So I almost always like turning the rate all the way down. And then automating the depth knob. So when you turn the rate down, these three knobs then control the flanger. When you have the rate up, it kind of does its own thing and LFOs around. But then when you turn the rate all the way down, it goes to 0.00. Then just when you modulate the depth, it changes the characteristic of the flanger. You can hear it adds in that metallic sort of high-end character. And then what I'm doing here is applying the same volume and filter modulation LFO to the mix. And that just kind of helps keep it clean, keep it a little bit more subtle. So this is a pretty subtle effect, but I think it does add some cool harmonic content and dynamics. So we're going to keep that in. And then once we have the post-processing on, we can A/B with it as well. Same sort of idea goes for the phaser. I'm not going to cover chorus. We can go ahead and play with a tonal delay right now, see how that sounds. So if you link it, you go down. So this is the classic tonal delay. When you use a delay in really small, delay amount, I guess. Delay time. That would be the correct word. Man, my brain just took a shit. So if you're taking from BPM down to, just not BPM, milliseconds, around 27 milliseconds. Sounds really good for E flat. Each key has a separate millisecond amount to sound in key. And then you can actually do the same thing here. You can try putting this LFO on the feedback. You can try it on the mix as well. So what tonal delay does is have that kind of characteristic. Sort of metallic feedback thing that you hear in dubstep a lot. And then here's something fun you can do right off the bat. You can just go ahead and turn the compressor on, turn it on multiband, then go. And that's basically just a built-in X for OTT. It's going to make it louder. It's going to bring up the frequencies, multiband compression, classic. So that's cool. I don't always use that. We'll turn that off for now. There's reverb, EQ, whatever. You can always apply another filter. We could go for something crazy like a comb. So for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to have it chilling right here. I think this is a pretty good bass patch to work from. And as always, experiment with everything. Find out what sounds cool. Take some risks. I don't know. Just here's the big thing with making music in my experience. The less fucks you give, the less you're attached to the outcome. And if you're not all stressed out about having to make a crazy dubstep bass, and you can just get lost in the process of sound designing, you're much more likely to create a good, usable dubstep bass than if Sorry, I'm checking my phone right now. You're much more likely to create an actual usable bass if you're just having fun with the process than you are if you're super stressed out about quote unquote having to make a good dubstep bass. So really just don't worry about it too much. Take risks, experiment, have fun, whatever. Just real quick, we could just try this. Oh no. Yeah, you know, just try different bend modes. Personally, I do like asim minus the best. So we go from here. So generally, the processing that I like to do, I have this nice EQ8 preset right here. It's the Fletcher Munson curve. If we look up what the Fletcher Munson curve is, so the Fletcher Munson curve is a graph that illustrates an interesting phenomenon of human hearing. When listening to music through your studio monitors or headphones, as the actual loudness changes, the perceived loudness our brain hears will change at a different rate depending on the frequency. So what this means essentially is that our ears and our brain actually have an EQ curve to them, right? So that's why, for instance, 3 to 5K frequencies sound more harsh than lower or higher frequencies because our hearing is more sensitive to them. You can see it right up here in this range right here. So I could go into EQing and how to EQ for a specific sound, but if you want to be lazy, applying a Fletcher Munson curve to your sounds generally makes them sound like more pleasing and more smooth, right? Check this out. And then I also have the low cut built in, so it's cutting off at 88 hertz, cutting off the sub bass. So you see if I boost it up to the opposite, like an opposite Fletcher Munson curve, it sounds really harsh. Ow. So you kind of Fletcher Munson it down some. And now I'm going to go ahead and put an OTT on it. I have a mid-side OTT rack preset right here. So what this is doing, I can send this preset or include it in the tutorial link or whatever. So this is just the straight mid and the straight side, but with a separate OTT. So it kind of theoretically really beefs up the stereo of your signal. And then I just have 3 macros for amount, output, and then time. I'm a much bigger fan of higher times with the OTTs because then it lets the dynamics come through a lot more. You can see we're peaking out like crazy here. Hopefully this doesn't sound like absolute ass on the recording. We'll see. And then the all-important G-clip. So G-clip is just a soft clipper. You could also use an Ableton saturator if you wanted to, just a soft clip on. So what soft clippers do, or distortion units do, for the most part, I would say this applies more to the idea of a soft clipper than it does a distortion unit, because not all distortion units are the same, but a soft clipper will cut everything off at 0, like a limiter does, but instead of limiting it, which is a form of compression, which causes that pumping or sort of like audio artifacting where you can hear it sort of changing, a soft clipper just chops it off right at 0 with a harmonic distortion algorithm. So instead of manipulating the volume, it distorts it in a harmonic fashion, cutting off at the 0 mark. So this is a cool plugin. Everyone uses it a lot. You can pump the fuck out of the gain. And you hear you get way more perceived volume. It's still hitting the exact same, you know, actual volume. The trade-off is just amount of perceived harmonic distortion there is. And then there's the softness, which is how it distorts coming up to 0. So this is, again, a perceived loudness thing and then a perceived cleanliness thing. It's still hitting 0. It's just how the harmonic distortion hits. Anywhere from 0 to like 50 or sometimes even 100 can sound really good, and then you can play with the gain. But the main utility of this here is just to make sure that you're cutting your bass off at 0. And again, there's a lot of audio engineers and producers who would cringe at this technique because it is exploiting digital gain structuring, and you can oftentimes, almost always, get a cleaner result if you mix down quietly than master at the end. But for bass music production, I find that making everything loud and mixing down loud and mastering loud, or even not mastering, just mixing down loud, and that's your final product, sounds the best. That's how a lot of my friends do it. That's how a lot of contemporary dubstep and bass music producers do it. That's kind of the approach that I use. I'm not saying this is right. This is just kind of what I do. So we have an OTT here. Sometimes what I do this Fletcher Munson EQ into the OTT. Then sometimes I will do another Fletcher Munson EQ. Experiment with that a little bit, and then I'll say fuck it and put another OTT on there. And then when I do OTTs with Xer, I like to go downward somewhere around here, upward up to 0, then time all the way up. So we just get even more perceived gain. Yeah, so the idea, just to explain this technically, I guess, is just that I EQ'd it once, cut the lows, cut out the harsh frequencies, OTT'd it, which makes it louder, beefier, brings up the frequencies, cut the harsh frequencies again, cut the low end again, and then OTT'd it again. So you're just doing the same thing again. And I mean, this is incredibly common with dubstep. You know, artists will have 3, 4, 5 OTTs on it. I generally cap out anywhere between 2 and 4. Usually 2 is the sweet spot for me. It'll be like EQ, OTT, EQ, OTT, soft clipper. But there's a lot to be said about spamming OTTs because it can really bring out interesting characteristics in sound. You can see we still have a really interesting stereo field going on. And yeah, I guess this is going to be part 1 of my Rogue Serum tutorials, and I hope it helped.